Secret codes helped slaves escape their brutal enslavement on southern plantations in the United States. Quilt patterns with secret codes helped communicate crucial information to slaves seeking freedom. From the moment the first slave landed on the shores of North America, captive slaves dreamed of running away and gaining their freedom. The Underground Railroad is one of the most successful and celebrated paths many slaves took to seek the freedom. In Barbara Brackman's book, Facts and Fabrications: Unraveling the History of Quilts and Slavery, Brackman said that free and escaped blacks as well as white people were part of the Underground Railroad movement. But the path to freedom was never easy. Runaway slaves had to travel by night and go through swamps, marshes, and even climb mountains. They did all of this while being hunted by men and dogs. There weren't any cell phones or GPS to help the slaves. There were no signs along the way to tell men, women, and children who were running for their lives if they were close to their final destination. However, it's believed that hundreds of former slaves successfully made their way north to their freedom. How were these runners able to communicate with those helping them without exposing themselves and being caught? It's believed that a secret code hidden in common quilts was one form of communication for passengers traveling the Underground Railroad. What was just a quilt to most people gave runaways important information. A simple pattern on a quilt hanging outside a house could tell a runaway slave they've reached a safe house or that they could be in danger. Quilt patterns made by enslaved women have been preserved to this day. According to Gladys Marie Fry and Stitched from the Soul, 15 states maintain original quilts made by slaves. The quilt code, as defined in the book Hidden in Plain View, is a mystery-laden, secret communication system. This system used quilt making to communicate messages to slaves traveling the Underground Railroad. What we know about quilt codes comes to us from the rich African American tradition of oral history. Oral history is a tradition tracing back to the original African land where slaves originated. Many Africans brought to America weren't allowed the privilege of learning to read or write. Many were punished for even trying to. Oral tradition was the main way slaves passed down their history. The knowledge of secret codes used in quilts to help runaway slaves is a part of that oral tradition. One example of a quilt code documented in the book Hidden in Plain View comes from Ozella McDaniel Williams. Williams, a quilter from Charleston, South Carolina, recited the following quilt code that has been passed down in her family for multiple generations. The code goes like this: the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada on a bear's paw trail to the crossroads. Once they got to the crossroads, they dug a log cabin on the ground. Shoefly told them to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties and go to the cathedral church, get married, and exchange double wedding rings. Flying geese stayed on the drunkard's path and followed the stars. In this coded message are 10 different quilt patterns that, according to Williams, communicated instructions to the runaway slaves preparing to travel the Underground Railroad. The quilt codes were a visual roadmap for the escapees to follow. The first quilt pattern is the monkey wrench. Here are some examples of what this quilt pattern looks like. According to Williams, the monkey wrench was a signal for the slaves to begin their escape preparations by collecting the tools they thought they would need on their journey north. The pattern was a signal for slaves seeking to escape to gather and prepare both the physical tools needed for the trip, but also the mental tools needed to be ready for the long, hard trip they were about to begin. The next quilt code was the wagon wheel. The wagon wheel was a signal for the slaves to prepare as many provisions as they could carry, as if they were packing a wagon for a trip. These would be items like food and clothing. Wagons were a common way of transporting slaves along the Underground Railroad. The third code was the bear's paw. This quilt pattern reminded the runaways to literally seek out and follow a bear's footprints. A bear's path would guide the slaves to possible food and water sources. The bear's path would also give slaves the best routes to follow, especially through the mountains. The fourth code was the crossroads. Cleveland, Ohio was considered to be the crossroads. It is believed that Cleveland was a major terminal of the Underground Railroad. Several houses and churches still standing today in Cleveland were safe havens for slaves making their way further north to Canada. The fifth code was the log cabin. No one is certain exactly what this quilting pattern really means. According to Gladys Marie Fry's book, Stitched from the Soul, this pattern was commonly mentioned in slave narratives about quilting. Williams explained in Hidden in Plain View that the log cabin pattern stood for an actual cabin near Cleveland, Ohio. Hidden in Plain View's authors believe the dug a cabin on the ground phrase refers to actually drawing a symbol on the ground in order to tell if it was safe to speak openly with that person or not. The next part of the code was the shoe fly. Some people think the shoe fly was a real person that helped escaped slaves. These helpers could have been free blacks who were members of secret societies like the Masons. Black Masons would be very familiar with the use of secret symbols and codes. The next quilt code were bow ties. In Hidden in Plain View, Williams says the bow ties quilt pattern was a message for the runaway slaves to dress in a formal manner. Being dressed in regular clothes would help the slaves blend in better as free black people in the area. If a runaway was seen in torn and ragged clothes, it may bring them unwanted attention. Flying geese is the next part of Williams' quilt code. Geese traveled north in the spring and summer. This information told slaves the direction they should be traveling and the best time of year to make their escape. Attempting to travel north through the Appalachian Mountains would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, during the winter months. The ninth code was the drunkard's path. One of the main ways to tell a person is drunk is by watching them try to walk. It's very hard for a drunk person to walk in a straight line. Drunk people stagger in different directions along the path to where they're trying to go. The drunkard's path code was a message to slaves that they should never travel in a straight line, but to stagger their movements. Traveling in a staggered pattern would make it more difficult for dogs and slave trackers to catch the runaway slaves. The 10th quilt code was the star. Follow the North Star is one of the most common phrases people think about when asked what they know about the Underground Railroad. The North Star, known as Polaris, is visible at all times of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Runaway slaves would always be able to know their direction of travel at night by keeping track of the North Star. This would be true if they traveled over land or by waterway. Although the quilt code shared by Williams seems very believable, there are many people who don't believe quilt codes were real at all. In Barbara Brackman's book, Facts and Fabrications Unraveling the History of Quilts and Slavery, she states that today's storytellers like to imagine a secret code giving potential escapees advice, but these stories are more fabrications than fact. Several first-hand accounts of former slaves that escaped document escapes that were more unplanned and unassisted than well-thought-out plans that use secret codes to help them escape. In conclusion, quilts are a special tradition and hold culture, whether they hold a secret meaning or not. So, the next time you see a quilt, you can check to see if it has a secret code.